All right, we got Daniel Martinez on here today. Very fired up for Coach to be with us. I've heard nothing but great things. Actually, both my staff, Coach McNally and Coach Heiss, have actually told me about you, Coach. And I know Coach Heiss told me that you gave a really good presentation at the Baylor Clinic, right, Coach?
Yes, sir. Talked above my head for about 40 of the 60 minutes.
And then you and Coach McNally go back as well. So, but anyways, very excited to kind of get into it. Let's start off with what we start off with a lot here, which is instead of just kind of going through your path about how you've gotten where you are today, I like to more trace it based off your philosophy of how that's developed and how you've evolved along the way, and especially with your unique path of directly being in coaching, some private sector stuff into the school with the Force Deck Company, and everything you've done. You just have a very interesting lens. So let's just start there.
Yeah, I think kind of what I was getting at before is for me, it's really always been just centered on learning and just trying to, I don't know, like an excitement and passion. There's an enthusiasm piece of it for sure for me. Like when I was a private coaching consultant, my first few businesses were kind of named after things that I think we start out thinking. One of the businesses I owned was called Elite Volleyball Performance, and that had a volleyball focus on it. And I realized pretty quickly that elite had nothing to do with what it takes to develop like youth and high school athletes. And then, of course, like I'm learning and reading, and I read John Wooden and looking at his pyramid of success. It's continued to influence me. I've kind of developed my own take on it here in the last year or two. But the word enthusiasm really spoke to me, and the word enthusiasm comes from entheos, which is Greek, which means the God within, and it means that as you demonstrate passion and enthusiasm, it brings out a divinity from inside of you. So I renamed my business Entheos Athletics, and that of course also transitioned into working with progressively more and more athletes from different sports, and kind of not being as narrow with volleyball, and then moving into the consulting deal, where I think the reality of it that hit me was in a lot of, I would say in the best possible and worst possible ways, just the reality that a lot of people are not good with vulnerability and letting people know, like, hey, like when it came time to decide what I felt like was important as a coach or a sports scientist or this or that, that I let some other things go in order to focus on where my heart is as an individual, as a coach, or like as I said. And so there were people who I think that realized that there were some gaps and they had some blind spots. And it just kind of struck me that in the best ways, people were really open to just learning and just being like, yeah, hey, let's get better. And I could tell that they weren't worried about what they didn't know. And in the worst ways, there were people who it was almost like they were afraid of like being found out, right? What they call like imposter syndrome. Like, because you don't know this means you're not a great coach, or you're not a good practitioner. And I guess the way that I've always approached things, I try to be a good human first, tended to break down some of those barriers. And it told me, like, people, I kept on getting complimented, and I guess it did. It kind of increased my visibility and my popularity to a certain extent. And I just kept on thinking, like, I just keep trying to be a good dude, like I keep on trying to think like I view the role as of support, in that case, of performance support and education, in my role with Force Decks. And it was like, so I always say there's a General McChrystal quote where he says, like, what do they need? Who do they need to be? What do they need to do? And how do I best support them to do that? So I've taken that in how I deal with athletes, and how I've dealt with coaches, and in how I've dealt with people, and almost to the point where I think, I don't know, it would almost put people off. Like, until they really get to know me, I think some people are like, he like, I'm pretty insatiable about like that. Like, it's just all about getting better. And I don't understand small talk. Like, I'm like, I just want to get to what does it mean for both of us to figure out, like, what do we need to do to get more from this? And then I think there's also, especially with respect to performance technology and measurement, there's a bit of skepticism, I guess, in terms of how it fits in. Like, people thinking about, how do you reimagine what your workday is, integrating these tools? What do I have to let go to put this in? And that balance, I think, is it's still something that has a lot of room to get worked out. Like, I had one NBA team, I won't say which one, and that'll be my attempt at whatever, being confidential about, like, but one team we had, their sixth best jumper in our vertical jump testing was in the dunk contest the year before that. And I'm telling the performance staff, I'm like, how the hell does this happen, right? Like, he's one of the best jumpers in the world. Like, he's on TV in front of millions of people around the world, and he's not even the best jumper on his team. Like, that's dumb. So how do we reformulate that thought process around that to think, like, instead of being like, oh, hey, let's analyze these numbers, to being like, how about we try to get the best out of what we know, who we know in this case are actually the best, and the fact that they're not means we've got a hell of a lot of work to do, and it has nothing to do with that test, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that that's just like I said, kind of a little bit of an insatiable piece of it. Like, I kind of, I don't know that I apologize, but I was talking to Roof before the Baylor clinic because Stacy just was on fire that morning. And I said, man, I said, I'm normally a pretty good pace. Like, I want to just like let you know what's in my head and just like show you what I'm thinking about, and just like there is an enthusiasm. It's like the passion thing is definitely a real thing for me. But I was like, I think Stacy might have me, and he told me after I presented, he was like, I don't know, man, you were going pretty hot there for a few minutes. Like, it was a pretty good clip. But that's just how I'm used to doing it, and I've stopped apologizing for it and just try to continually find ways to make sure that people that I'm not so caught up in just expressing myself that it quiet quiets the voice of others around me, like that you learn what it means to like take things down a notch and try to really connect, that's still, it's a continual process of like learning what it takes to build that full engagement, including going into a force plate test as much as going into a dynamic warm up, right?
For sure. I think with that mentality, which I have a very similar growth mindset, is that at least throughout my career, a lot of things because of that have led me to trial and error.
Yeah.
And some of those trials have led to things that we still do to this day that were great.
Hmm.
And some of those trials have led to error,
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, you talked about the vulnerability piece of being able to sit there and say, hey, we tried this, didn't work, moving on. What are some of, if that's been your mindset, obviously you've been through it, what have been some of your errors with that mentality, and what have been some of your best growths, saying like, man, this actually really worked?
Yeah. I'd say probably I would say that on the hygiene side of things, I think I approached it a lot in many ways, like a lot of us did. Like they call it being caught in corrective hell, right? Like, I think that I approached it from a way like, this is going to fix everything, and so we invested more time into it, and it very is. It's more. I refer to it in two buckets now, as basically being hygiene and performance. So that kind of stuff, I think, still has a place, but I just refer to it as hygiene, being like, hey, it's like brushing your teeth. Like, you can do 60 minutes of it, and it's no better than doing, 2, 3 minutes of it. It's like there's loads and there's dosages that make a lot of sense, and there's times where we get pushed into the idea that we have to apply these schemes, the way that it's always been done, and some of it's just wrong, like. And so I would say that in stepping back into the collegiate environment, I'd say that I kind of caved under the pressure of what I felt like needed to be distributed in the workloads across our teams, and that moved me away from like kind of the more like Dan Paff has like clearly been like my most influential mentor and like the strongest voice in my head as far as like finding real truth and rationale and programming. And I got away from that, and it's taken me the past year to kind of figure out exactly how to realign things that make more sense for me in that way. Uh, but on the positive side, I'd say, where if that's on the talking about the corrective stuff and the hygiene stuff, now I kind of just view that, I always articulate it as being like a pit stop. Like, hey, yeah, you always need it. And it's not like it's ever just going to fix everything, especially in this day and age where like college athletes have lost like just years and years of development across a more broad spectrum of mastery that we would hope that they would bring to this. Like, yeah, that there's a lot of short-sightedness in that process, and thinking that I think we should be far more concerned on the environment. But then past that, I think some of the stuff that like I've just been so adamant about, especially in having added force plates like into the equation, that like there is 100% truth to this part of the process. Like, some of that strength power orientation side of things, like I feel more strongly about than ever. And some people look at it and I think they see some stuff that I don't really know. Like, to me, it seems not really advanced, but I know it's just way different from how people are used to orienting strength power development. So I feel like people are skeptical because it's not just the basics of strength power orientation. It's just kind of a different entryway, a different pathway, if you will. And I think some people, there's probably a skepticism on that because they're like, well, why would I need to move away from something that had this fundamental truth? And for me, it was just in looking at the numbers. Like I think in terms of what actually translates in force plate measurement as well as in the actual training process, and seeing that there's clearly a hardware piece to it where I recognize, especially in working with a lot of female athletes, that I could teach them to be a better jumper skill wise and orientation wise, where they could express more of what they have available right now without any change in their strength and power development through coordination and kind of special skills, special strength stuff regarding like vertical jumping drills and things like that. That, like I said, it's not really advanced, but it's just a different pathway that I could teach them to be a better jumper, but not a higher jumper. But then there's that higher piece that is clearly a difference maker, especially in college populations where you can do all of that stuff in the world, but without that extra horsepower, without that displacement, if the hardware is not there, that puts a definite ceiling on development as well. Like we get this a lot from our end where rehab people be like, oh, I just crushed that guy. He's like so strong, but I crushed him with body weight. I'm like, but the strength piece is still a very real piece for them and how savagery is expressed in their tasks, in their life, like as a competitive athlete. And without that piece to it, it's so I would say now more than ever, I believe in like the compatible and complementary themes more than anything, that you can access some of that with really low threshold kind of type activities, but you won't fully develop and express it without the horsepower piece.
Yeah. I think one thing we're trying to hone in on here with all of that is instead of focusing what we've been talking about, instead of focusing on a lot of position specific stuff, more focusing on deficiency specific things. But one thing we always talk about is like what are the ceilings of what's transferable.
For sure.
Like like I don't know that in the beginning of my career I thought that you could ever be too strong, but I certainly think you can be strong enough. And now
Sure.
I don't necessarily know what that cap is, but I know there's a point in time that when I look at an RSI of a guy, and if he's so far on the elastic deficiency side of things, is putting 20 more pounds on his squat going to do anything to help him become a better football player? And I think there's limits. I think there's ceilings on both ways, and I think it's that where we talk about optimization or optimizing these guys and finding those levels. Where are you at with that
Now,
internally?
yeah, very similar process, I think and I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. Like one of the big things that comes up in force plate measurement with dual force plates is the asymmetry piece. So I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who runs a pretty big strength conditioning program, and we were talking about the reliability piece, like on the statistics side. And I was just basically, I think because of that, you can't, I always say, like, would you take this case to trial, right? Like if you're a lawyer and you got to go before the judge, who could be the sport coach, right? Depending on what the scenario is, could be them. And you're going to be like, would you take that to them, that you feel confident in their return to play, that you feel confident in like their ability to perform the way they need to perform? And I think the reality is that because it's inherently noisy, that you need multiple tests or multiple ways, not necessarily just to measure, because I think that sometimes like not that we overdo that piece, but just that the idea that our ability to articulate our experience with student athletes that we are profoundly invested in, that in itself should carry just as much weight, and whether or not we feel like we have their engagement and saying like, yeah, hey, like when I watch them do this, I don't feel like they're doing what I asked them to do. uh, Across their entire career, which is probably the same of their experience and their time developing prior to this time as well. So it's like we haven't been able to fully grasp their attention and their awareness yet. And with that being a limiting factor, everything else is limited, So trying to find ways to deconstruct development in that way and figure out how that is. Like we're in the process. I've got a great professor in there's a sport management program here and we're working on a new intake questionnaire, because I've told people from a load monitoring standpoint and from an overall measurement standpoint, I always tell people we start with the development pathway reversed, where we start by measuring their feelings. Oh, how do you feel today? Or how do you feel? Then that drives their behavior to a certain extent, especially across teams and programs. Are better athletes always being better athletes? But the average experience of being that, getting caught up in their feelings, like ET always says, there's nothing really behind that drives their behavior. Oh, I'm tired, like, and then they give you tired work, and then that becomes their character as an athlete. I always tell people you have to switch that and figure out how to channel character first. Like, what is your identity as an athlete? Allow that to drive their behavior, and then that you have feelings on the backside of that process, right? Because you believe in what you're becoming. But I've moved a long way from, I think, looking at that and being critical of us measuring with GPS and all these things and being like, I don't care what this says, because that guy skipped his last 3 lifting sessions, right? Like, or like whatever the scenario is, or I can tell by that it's so much less than what I believe that athlete's truly capable of, that I want to be working on that problem. So what I was coming back to it, we're developing a questionnaire that I believe will help us to initiate that process in our initial intake, and then give us ways to reflect on it through their development.
How specific? So, like, especially for us, we have different tiered programs between our freshman guys and our guys that are 5 years deep into this. Obviously, we get significantly more specific with our 5th-year senior, who we know exactly where he lies. And when you've worked with all different levels of athletes, when you have your young athletes, or I guess it could be any age of an athlete who just has so many deficiencies, everything's a deficiency. Are you spending a lot of time RSIing them? Are you spending much time like saying, oh, we're going to do this to bring this, or is it just kind of, hey, generally we need to push the curve this way? Or what are you doing with those younger, more general athletes?
Yeah, I think in that, a lot of the stuff that I'll do is just try, I always communicate it as being positions, forces, and readiness, right? Like, you got to be able to get in the positions first, and that's with respect to like FMS stuff, like, not so much specific to the measurement of the FMS, but I think to the language that they've communicated overall. Like, you have to be able to get into the right positions. And one of the big deficiencies that we see, one of the things that Sparta Science as a group attacks, which I think, admittedly, like, you have to attack it, is like athletes' ability to flex and extend in like a cohesive fashion, right? Like, my thing when I watch, especially with respect to RSI, is I'm always like, track athletes could put out really awesome RSIs early in their development, right? But those guys are as bad as anybody in terms of flexing and putting their bodies into like a true like athletic, universal athletic position. Like, they're not good at it. Put them on a barbell, put them in like an athletic development orientation system, like in strength and conditioning, and yeah, they don't yield and flex well, just like athletes in the NBA, right? Like, the idea that because they express that means that's somehow going to change like our development process. I think you have to be able to get in positions first, and it has to be in a way that I don't view it as much as like the slow and fast stretch shortening cycle, as much as like across the positions available for the body to utilize. Does that make sense? Like, I find that boundary between the fast and slow, I'm always like, you're talking about basically elastic muscle behavior versus like this ability to flex and contract, right? Like, but each one has the capacity to demonstrate more of that, more of each quality. Like, when someone does a drop jump, there are terrible drop jump videos that I see all the time of people, and I'm like, I wouldn't even bother to measure that. Like, I'm not even like, I mean, if you want to and say, hey, here's our improvement from when you first did that. Oh yeah, but by the way, I didn't teach you how to do that, like, just to have like a solid starting point. Like, I think there's a lot of that, which, like, I don't know how to communicate whether that's necessary or not. For me, I personally don't think that kind of measurement, just saying like, oh, hey, you weren't good at this at all and you really sucked at it, and I measured you doing it, to now you know how to do it. Like, I'm not caught up in those kinds of improvements, Like, especially in collegiate environments where our volumes are much higher. Like I'd much rather be working on getting people to understand the kind of engagement it takes to teach yourself to put yourself in those positions in a way that reflects, like I said, full engagement, like athletes being tuned in and ready to go.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think the thing with positions, or at least what I preach or what I've seen, is a lot of those positions have bandwidths tailored
Yeah,
to that specific athlete too. And I think that's the one thing is I agree 100% as far as I look at it more conceptually. Like I look at
for
it as
sure.
like a football play. Like, yeah, if you're a receiver and you just know your route, that doesn't help too much. If you understand the whole concept of what the offense is trying to accomplish,
A
it
hundred
makes it a lot.
percent.
And so with positions, that's how I could try to explain as well. Is like, look, these are conceptually what we're trying to do. Now, based off of your anatomical anatomy and dispositions, you're gonna hit that position a little differently than
For
than
sure.
Fred might hit it. But those concepts need to be hit. And then there's bandwidths on those systems, right? It's like no two movements are ever going to be identical, even with the exact same athlete. So those bandwidths are big, and that's one thing that, and I've said this a few times now. When I got to Buffalo, one thing I didn't know is I was at Akron the previous 7 years. So I
Mm-hmm.
knew every athlete's bandwidths. Like I
Mm-hmm.
just knew. I knew when they were having an okay day. I knew
Yeah.
when they were moving well. I knew when something was wrong. And that's something that, it took me a couple months to really learn our guys' bandwidths here and
Yeah.
be able to stay on top of those things and really understand, like, hey man, we got to regress here a little bit because we're not even getting into the positions. And that was
Yeah.
something that hit me hard.
Yeah, and like I would like if we use what's something really common in the literature right now, like weightlifting derivatives, and saying like, okay, well you can do a jump shrug and it's higher velocity than a hang clean or a power clean or something like that, right? Like my critique of that process currently has been, well, but is that velocity influential for which athlete, right? Like if you have an athlete who needs to limit jumping volume, like a volleyball athlete, yeah. But if you have an athlete who does not have limitations, well, then a jump squat or some movement like that is still a higher velocity than a jump shrug. So then the athletes, their type themselves, they're like their build, their structure, right? That leads to the bandwidth piece where I like that's the one where I use that tends to be pretty accessible when we're doing force plate evaluation of saying like, well, you've got your fast athletes who are always going to be fast because they're generally smaller and lighter. That doesn't mean they're your best athlete. Then you have your big, strong people who, again, are not your best athlete, but they fit a little bit of a bucket. The people who are a little bit big, but also pretty fast, and the people who are not quite as small, but are also fast and strong, like that tends to tell you like exactly the direction you're trying to get everybody to move. It's just you're not going to have that available from a bandwidth standpoint, just depending on how far they fit off of that profile, right? Like baseball pitchers is a prime example. It's super common in hitting positions in volleyball. Like their structures are so uniquely suited with specific, like NBA is the same thing with wingspan versus height, things like that. You see these things over and over and over that if we can figure out a little bit how to orient that using that piece of it, then it's like you realize really quickly why certain systems work well and don't work well. When athletes or when programs, teams can't recruit in a way that optimizes that piece, you have to approach your development from a different place, right? Like trying to like out muscle the musclest guys, like I said that really poorly, but you guys know what I'm saying. Like trying to out muscle the team that can't be out muscled is like it's you can't do it, right? You have to find like some other way to channel savagery, and like I think that's what leads. It's like mixed martial arts is the same thing. Like back in the day, it was like the idea of someone having more than one skill set was absurd, but now it's like it's the standard, right? Like GSP was like definitely like a huge outlier in that process, and I think that's what most of us would say we would like to create. At the same time, certain sports are going to bias in a certain way. Certain positions are going to do the same thing, and so yeah, if we're not taking a better lens to figuring out what the real challenge of saying like, hey, I can do this number of jumps at this speed, and it's no more valuable than spending half the time on that and working on being more, stronger for that athlete in that population. Like in a way that relates really positively with pharmacology, like it tells us exactly how our dosages are. It's the same stuff like Dan Paff talks about in tracking, and why he's such a phenomenal like multi-event, why he's qualified athletes in like 16 different events for world championships or for the Olympics. It's like it's an absurd number, but like being able to deconstruct that from a development standpoint is awesome.
I know well, I guess, yeah, this is like a 12-hour question answer, I should say, but just talking, and we're kind of like working around your training philosophy right now. Just generally dive into that for me.
Yeah, so I would say so. I'm presenting on it at our seminar in December, but there's one main thing. So like the title of my talk is Moving Slow and Fast, which is a take on Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is basically just talking about like the idea that we have these like optimized loads is important, but being able to deconstruct it to make it accessible is just as important, right? Like being able to find ways to help people develop quality. So it basically is a little bit of a high-low approach, but for me, it's also about value. There's a Warren Buffett quote that I use all the time that says, "Price is what you pay, value is what you get." So a lot like we were talking about before in terms of like how strong is strong enough, and then what the emphasis of how you get there is, I think is especially critical. Because like people, like I've talked to people about this before, where like let's say someone has a 500-pound back squat and we did the test, but if you looked at the curve, and let's say if we were looking at something like bar velocity, and we actually saw that their 475 was more explosive, so like you look at a power curve, all of a sudden that's your best effort, but we were chasing that 500. Like there's nothing wrong with chasing 500, but I'm going to spend way more time developmentally focused on loads in that curve around 475, right? Like we have to have the ability to scale that back and consider like what's truly important about that. Like, cause I think that they are 100% complementary, but because of that, it means that we've got to be way more selective about the fatigue that's accumulated on every load underneath of that, right? Which tends to lead you to like to more of a polarized approach. There's something in the endurance world called the polarization index, and it's a pretty simple it's I can't give it to you right now, but it's a pretty simple formula where they look at the distributions from a microcycle standpoint on like what is considered high intensity in their system and what's considered low intensity. So something like that, I think, is like if you look at 100-meter sprinters, right? Like somebody who's running at like 11 meters per second. Well, what's a 75% effort for someone who runs that fast? It's like a 14-second 100-yard run, right? Like it's like that's blazing, right? So it's like I think the ability to figure that part out, I think is now more than ever more critical, so we can get rid of more of the waste. So that's pretty much what my system is. I think from a movement quality and integrity standpoint, I tell people a lot, like good movement means you should be able to slow it down and speed it up. It shouldn't be that different across your movement speed. And if it is, there's something that's growing more disconnected, so in events like sprinting and things like weightlifting movements, two things that I enjoy coaching thoroughly. Like in movements like that, it's really easy for an experienced coach to be able to see those breakdowns become compounded against load. And it means that we have to be more discriminating into how these loads are applied, right? That might involve like a discussion on weightlifting derivatives, or it might be something that like, if we think of like how movement quality translates. I had a good friend of mine tell me, he's like, yeah, good weightlifting is like a baby with a barbell. Like that's like, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like people always show the squat with babies, but you're like, yeah, I guess a baby could do an overhead position pretty well as well. But we also know that it's more than that, right? Like I see people always like, there's female athletes very early in their career that can bottom out a snatch, but should they be doing that? Like, do they have the joint integrity to be able to create that position effectively, right? Like, or is that really just poor motor control and excessive flexibility, like, so I think because there's similar to our team and our strength condition culture, because there's always so much going on, we have to be vigilant about defending standards across the developmental process, like, so for me, probably the 2 points of emphasis, I would say like high threshold patterns. Like we want those to be able to be expressed across close to what we're talking about as being like optimized, like weightlifting movements being fast and snappy, strength, power. Let's just say basic strength development, hex bar deadlift, squatting, pulling. Those being able to be expressed with like a push the floor away kind of emphasis, right? Always representing some acceleration. And then we use a lot of general strength series. So I've got several like different series that we use where we basically put a series of like extensive plyos or extensive like coordination movements, crawling patterns, things like that into series. And that's where we put a good chunk. We compromise on the middle, and then we put a good chunk of time into that for a good chunk of the year, right? And sometimes it surprises me. Like we started doing some Indian clubs work with volleyball last spring, and then we introduced some new stuff starting the year in season. So that was a little bit clunky, but it was shocking, absolutely shocking to me to see that people who swing their arm for a living have no idea how to slow down and swing their arm with a little more motor control emphasis. Like absolutely, of course it shouldn't have been shocking, like all of us know, but every time I see it, it's shocking to see just how poorly they understand like where their hand is relative to like their elbow and their shoulder and their rib cage. And then the idea that for me, attacking that on a volleyball court is completely inaccessible, right? In basketball, like there's certain critics of approach from an athlete development standpoint model like I tend to resonate towards. There's critics in the NBA who are like, because it's a competition and an entertainment oriented league, they're like, I don't know if you can develop athletes like that at the NBA level. Like there's people who would legitimately not develop their athletes, I guess is kind of what that's saying, which is ludicrous. But there's people who are defending the load monitoring piece as being the more central piece. And that's the part that's very incongruent for me. But my criticism, the first criticism I always have for them when we're discussing such a thing is just like, hey, I get what that load monitoring tells you in terms of the number of accelerations and decelerations and how that's being expressed. And it's 100% savagery, way more than what we can do on a force plate, standing in place with their hands on their hips. Nevertheless, you can't touch that from a development standpoint, which means you can't break down some of the errors in stretch shortening cycle and muscle and tendon health. You can't break those things down with that emphasis. It needs to be scaled back, which is why I always communicate something like the counter movement jump of being like the 1-inch punch of strength and conditioning programs testing of the sports science side of things. Is like, it's about being able to do more with less. And I think when athletes don't understand how to do that, it's giving you a lot more insight than you think into how they understand how to express strength and power, how they express how to demonstrate elasticity, how they even RSI to a certain extent. And then you have to be able to assess that and give your program some direction with respect to how the strength loads are applied and how power loads are applied and how the more low threshold coordination movements are applied.
How specifically are you using RSI for your day-to-day or evaluation tools? How are you using it?
Pretty similar to what I just said, is that for athletes who I have more confidence in what they're expressing, I use it all the time. We use it weekly. Not certainly not daily, because I feel like for me, microcycle structure is a big part. I tell people that all the time. I'm like, when people are talking about like load monitoring and like whatever tactical periodization, I'm like, I'll just bias towards microcycle construction. Like I'm building it based on what my expectation of what I'm going to get is. And I'm also counting on my ability to build the engagement necessary to ensure that I'm getting quality performances through that cycle, through that training week. But at the same time, I also have the ability to communicate to RSI and say, hey, well, how much you flex on your vertical jump is limited. Therefore, you're limiting your mechanical muscle power contribution. You're purely counting on elasticity, and you're not very elastic. So, it's like that doesn't make any sense, and like that's for a lot of athletes, it makes sense on something like a counter movement jump to alter their positions to show that they can establish and develop more congruency in that task, right? Like for me, it kind of comes down to like a weightlifting pattern. Like if we allowed someone to be really shallow with how they would express like a hang power clean or a hang power snatch and expected them to lift heavier weights, like you just can't do it. It doesn't mean you can't represent quality in those positions. It means you're limiting what qualities are being expressed. So you're definitely going to get more like a little bit of reactive strength, but also more of like an elastic quality. But you're not showing me that you really know how to take the slack out and represent more congruency, utilizing more joints to demonstrate more overall muscle power, right? Like we know that there are positions that will allow us to optimize acceleration. So, which will be limited in something that's really short and shallow, right? So my thing has always been like, if I would coach that, and if I would coach something like landings, and if I would coach all these things, like I take the responsibility to do that as it lines up with the sports science monitoring and testing piece. That's the heavy hand that I want to use. And then I want to be as implicit as possible around the test where I'm no longer coaching that strategy. I just want them to express it the way they understand it. Jump as high as you can, as fast as you can. And then if they took the idea that we also want to land off of that pretty seriously, then my landing data should also have pretty good integrity as well. Alternatively, you have people who, because of the way that we've coached, the athlete jump, oh, we're testing a jump. I don't worry about my landing. My athlete should always be worried about landing, right? Like that's how I view that process.
Yeah, it was fascinating back in February when I first got here. We were, I mean, for the most part, a kind of cross board, especially as weird as it sounds, a lot of our skill players were very, they lacked a lot of rigidity in the ankle calf soleus complex, and they were very non-elastic, and their RSIs scored that way too. But we had like, you know, we'd be running like tempos, right? Like I think the first one was like 4 sets of 5 at 50 yards, like 75% tempos, and we were having dudes tweaking hamstrings, like 10 dudes.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there and I'm watching, and I'm like, what's going on? Like I'm trying to figure it out, and really what I started thinking, I was like, man, like these kids are running with all muscle. Like there's no reactiveness in the ground every step they take. They're not using any tendon. They're using muscle every single time. So those muscles are overworking. And as we got more reactive, and we really tailored all of our plyometrics to rigidity and reactiveness.
Sure.
And as we did that, that's first off, they started running differently. You know, you started seeing that bounce in the on that stab in the ground, and then those things started going away very quickly. But it was a very like just what you just said. It was a realization in that moment.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. And I think like that's the idea, the movement, like if we do something like slow it down a whole bunch and then, you know, like they're doing marching drills or something, a lot of people could find some rigidity in that, but then you test it, then it's like, well, that's not it then, right? Like we need to figure out, that's why I like some of the overhead stuff, like the overhead running drills and things like that. Cause you can see some of that, how, as you challenge the chain, that those connections, the weakest links are going to be exposed. And so finding ways to expose them in a way that's safe and that's progressive is super critical. But at the same time, like, right, like if we're counting too much on like moving slow or like slow isometrics, things like that, like there's a balance to how we do all of it, you know. And like and again, like I said, is that I keep on describing it as a vigilance of being like there's so much going on all the time that there's not a point where there's nothing going on where I can just let someone, oh, well, this is this exercise, just do this. I'm like, you can be teaching something all the time, but then you have to allow the athletes to express themselves in a way that you feel like tests your system, you know?
I think that's a freaking awesome point too. And it's just using an example of putting a PVC pipe over your head and running through a wicket drill. It's like you can sit there and tell an athlete, hey, you're doing A, B, and C. These are the issues. And to me, at least in my opinion, until they can feel it, until they're aware of it, they can't correct it. And that's what to your point, I freaking love just, okay, hold this PVC pipe over your head, and all of a sudden they'll look at you and go, oh my God, I feel it. I can feel it now. With any of those markers, I think that's a great point. And doing that in any realm of training is creating that self-awareness, and then you give them a chance to actually feel it and correct it.
That's it. And there's so in emotional intelligence, which for me, there's a couple of different heads to this, right? Like, but in emotional intelligence, it's the same thing, which is there's essentially 4 domains to emotional intelligence. And the first one is awareness and self-awareness, right? Like, which means that if our athletes don't know that it's important that they're aware of their own limitations and not just that we're aware as their coach, like that's what this process is centered around, is like being able to figure out like what you're not good at, and then to put some heat to it, right? Like to stress test it essentially. Then we're never going to make the impact that we're capable of, like, and a lot of kids, like, what do they say? Uh, average kid this day and age has like the attention span of a goldfish, like, I'm like, but I tell people a lot, like when that's brought up, like as a criticism, like, but is that the place you want to coach from, right? Like, where like every message that I package to you is going to be super short and brief, and then you just go because you're just an animal, like, or am I going to try to get you to understand that no, you don't need to be thinking all the time, but you need to have a strategy, and you need to stress test this yourself and see if this is your best. Because I mean, geez, I had a softball athlete in an off time lift this morning, and she was fully prepared to mail this session in, like, and I like kind of sneaking in under me, like on her front squat workout. And I asked her like, hey, oh, how was that? She's like, oh, it's okay. I'm like, what the hell does okay mean? Like, was that challenging? Like, and she's like, well, no, not really. And I'm like, okay, like, that's like, you need to come in here ready to challenge yourself. And like, the more of those conversations that we can multiply and duplicate, like across our environment, like the more of that we do, the more like it affects everything. Everything affects everything. But if we're not doing that, like I use the example in the presentation at Baylor, there's something in nature called a trophic cascade, which is the example that I used was Yellowstone and the wolves, right? You guys know that story? They took the wolves out of Yellowstone, and the ecosystem kind of collapsed, right? Like there was overgrowth of like vegetation, like the deer population exploded, like, so they put the wolves back, and it changed the way the rivers flowed because it corrected that lack of balance in the system, right? So if you can find a dominant predator in a system, and in that case they remove it, and watch how the environment collapses. So it's not always about weakest links. Sometimes it's about finding the strongest and putting some heat behind that, and then trying to get people to understand that that's what this is supposed to be about, like right. That it's, yeah. And again, I take the process seriously. Yeah.
What are we, and I'll let these guys ask a couple questions here, but I want to hit this at least. What are some things injury prevention wise? I know obviously we've kind of dived into, but some things that we're not doing enough of that we should be doing that can really give our athletes a better chance to make it through their sports without injuries.
Yeah. So this is like going back to what I was talking about, moving fast and slow. Again, being able to scale these efforts, for me, it's almost like an overcommitment to a specific loading scheme, like at certain time points, a little bit too much of the linear periodization process, right? Where training, everything we do is paradoxical, right? Like you make one choice, right? There's going to be an opportunity cost of what you're not able to do. So to me, like the way that I've looked at that process is that to create more diversity, like when we have that high-low approach, I also have where anywhere an athlete would tend to mail in an effort, I try to find a way to create an opportunity for growth. So for instance, like your first or second set of like a hex bar deadlift, right? The athlete is just completely like not tuned in, or like the first set of a heavy bench press workout. Same, you just see people just floating with the bar, right? Like I'm trying to find ways to enrich that environment, preferably on like a second set. Like number one, you want to stress test your environment and see like, hey, like from the dynamic warm up to the end, when you walk out of the building, like we want to be switched on. But then the second piece is saying like, I need to find ways to give you the opportunity to show me what switched on looks like, So we'll do something like a breaking jump alternatively. So they might do like a regular hex bar deadlift set, and then we'll do basically like up on the ball of the foot, and then a snap down basically, but with the hex bar and then just a higher velocity eccentric movement, right? Yeah. Which is pretty subtle, is nothing that's going to like crush anyone at any time, especially if we use like the basics of like 30% of your hex bar deadlift is a safe power training zone, right? Is where to a certain extent it could optimize power production. Something like that is not a threatening condition, and that modest exposure. Alternatively, to get similar loading from a force velocity perspective, you'd have to be on like a 10-yard box, right? Like the velocity would have to be so high and they'd have to jump down so aggressively. But by affecting the force a little bit, by increasing your mass, now we've changed that formula a little bit in a really positive way because it's far more accessible. So that's something that I think if we could find ways to improve that, I think the eccentric side of it is a super critical part, but it can't be all K-box stuff, right? Because the first thing is that tool in a lot of systems is just not as accessible. So some of the band work, I think anything that accentuates eccentrics, but then being selective about the exposure, right? Like microdosing being like, and then also timing through your training week, making sure that somebody has the ability to give you some good quality effort in such tasks. I would say things like that, looking for subtle ways to shift that from maintenance to development.
No doubt. I like it. Any questions you guys have and I didn't cover?
Okay, I can go. All right. So Daniel, I knew I wanted to ask you about this before we got rolling here. One of the things that's been on my mind lately is looking at the counter movement jump as a measure of fatigue. And I think it was Brian Mann that I heard talk on this originally, mentioned something about using just jump height probably isn't the most reliable measure for looking at fatigue. I just wanted to get your take on if you had access to force plates, what are the metrics that you're looking at, and why would you look at one over another?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. Like I always describe to people, it's kind of a first layer as being jump height and RSI mod, because RSI mod can give you kind of some information as a form of surrogacy of like the more complex adaptation, which I'll go to in a minute. But RSI mod is jump height divided by contraction time. Okay, so it's from the start of the movement to takeoff. So that in itself, like you'll get people who are like, I'll describe it basically as like somebody who's a fast jumper, which again is the person who I said they're going to flex less. They're going to just kind of be more elastic, but they're not going to jump as high. You can see people like I tested a two-time Olympian once, a female long jumper who just did that kind of strategy, but being a long jumper and being an Olympian, super explosive. So that in that case, I don't mess with that athlete's strategy if she can demonstrate savagery in such a way. But 90% of the time, they're going to jump not as high, but it's going to be really fast, really snappy. So that's someone who jumps faster in general. So that will spark or it will spike RSI mod, right? But their jump height might be less. Okay. Then you'll have someone who takes longer to do the jump, but they jump much higher overall. But because that contraction time was longer, their RSI mod is going to be lower, right? So what you're really looking at in that case is being able to influence each of those strategies in the best possible way, is saying like, well, I'm probably going to need better positions with the fast jumper, and I'm probably going to be more contraction speed with the bigger jumper. The first thing is, from a hardware standpoint, the person who put out the big jump but just wasn't able to do it explosively is far more trainable than the athlete who could not flex as well, right? Just to, kind of depending on what where they are developmentally, but teaching someone to flex and load who's spent their whole life to a certain extent not flexing as much and loading in such a way, that one I'll just say from experience takes more time. But that's how that first layer gives you a lot of insight into both. Okay. So if they check the jump height box and the RSI mod is up high, that's pretty good. But if they're jumping fast but not high, because it's an index, which is always a limitation of any index, because it's an index, that doesn't come through, which means you've got to go further, right? So the one that's pretty dominant in the literature and that I'm a big critic of is eccentric deceleration rate of force development. That's the load metric for Sparta. And then it can be extremely influential. For me, the challenge is here, hold on, I've got to plug in my laptop because it's going to die. One sec.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Giving a lot of juice right now.
Damn
Yeah.
right.
One sec. Trying to be patient so I don't rip anything and flip a laptop over or something like that.
When did that
So,
happen?
so eccentric decel RFD. So that metric is basically telling you. So a lot of people are not aware of this, but there's in the scientific literature, there's two braking periods. There's what's called braking rate of force development, and there's deceleration rate of force development. Okay. It's a pretty subtle distinction, but one of them is I'll just say simply is like from when you hit the brake to when you stop, where the other one is just the stopping. It's just you're going really fast and then slam on the brakes. So decel RFD is the slamming on the brakes. So that's the reason that I like it, because it can be insightful, but again, from an athlete development perspective, if you're not looking at are they effective in the positions that they're utilizing, that's where a spike there, like in Sparta's system, it's the same thing. For me, the fundamental piece of it is I'm like, yeah, hey, that's insightful, but it's also, if I'm approaching that from an athlete development standpoint, the most important thing about that is that I've got a lot of coaching that I need to do, and that's a PE consideration, not a force plate consideration. Does that make sense? There's times in our environment that I'm not able to, I can't highlight that and say, hey, for you, this kinds of stuff. And it's just a part of our curriculum, but I don't have to coach to that. But there's times where somebody's lag effect in my coaching to their testing, that's where I get to see that come out. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, what I use, I guess it's different than what Sparta does, is I use eccentric deceleration impulse, which is force times time in the eccentric phase. And so those things, I always describe it as an equalizer, because the names of the metrics will change a little bit depending on what the force plate system you're using is. But if you understand the math behind it, in the eccentric phase, what's cool about it is that in impulse, I always say if performance is a symphony, it's not about banging louder drums. What you'll see is that if an athlete puts out a big eccentric impulse, it could actually be a much lower jump. And the reason for that is that it tends to be, it's time sensitive. So impulse is force times time, right? So if the forces are relatively stable, and the big thing that's going to change from a readiness standpoint is going to be the time that was available based on fatigue and readiness, then that's what you're really looking at, is more or less contraction time. So in the eccentric, so if they put out the same force, but it took them more time, now that impulse value has floated, but it doesn't mean that because it's bigger number, that's a better effort, right? That's what you're actually looking at. So it tends to balance out. When you see that spike, you're going to see decel RFD come down like this, where all of our best jumps are like a big decel RFD and like a 90% eccentric decel impulse value. Does that make sense? So it's like this like subtle shift where
probably the decel impulse is probably not from having a longer time period of doing that, probably just from producing more force in the same period of time.
That's exactly it. Okay. I also use eccentric peak power and eccentric peak velocity as kind of my surrogate. You in ForceX system, they have eccentric mean power available as well. So that's kind of your average adaptation eccentrically. Okay. And then I look at their peak force and peak velocity. So what you'll see, which is super, like, it's definitely like a sports science thing. Like if you want to go, Verkhoshansky or Zatsiorski, whatever it is, the forces are relatively stable over time. You will not see big changes in peak forces if the athlete is not consistently getting stronger. Okay. So that'll be really subtle across your training blocks. What tends to change is the velocity eccentrically of their contraction. If they are fast on the gas pedal getting into the jump and then hard on the brakes, you're going to see that they're going to put out consistently big velocities. But what you'll also see is that they don't necessarily tolerate those velocities well, because they do not have the muscle tendon adaptation available yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what we see, so there's if we think of how that influences the concentric phase, what we'll see is that their jump height will be preserved. Okay. So they'll jump just as high because the body will figure it out. But impulse up to 50 milliseconds, there's a value called the concentric impulse, 50 milliseconds. What you'll see that time period represents is what is from the bottom position of the jump up until they're first starting to accelerate coming out. And you'll see these huge lags in that, even though their ultimate jump height ends up being around the same, even though their overall impulse is about the same. Well, it's the same, but it's late because they are not strong at those explosive joint angles when they're actually at their weakest point, right? So for me, it's always an action reaction thing, which is that if I'm teaching athletes to be a savage of being big time on the gas pedal eccentrically, and I'm teaching them how to apply bigger brakes with our strength and power strategy, right? Like our development strategy, then what we will see is that delayed transmutation effect. Essentially, like, the time window can vary a little bit, but you'll see a delayed effect that as they're getting used to just being on the gas pedal and then slamming on the brakes, now their body is going to actually create a secondary adaptation to that. And then they're going to be really fast at both of those. Early in that time window, at those really weak joint angles, they're going to be way more explosive and stronger. But you also know that they were not more conservative in their braking strategy, which is what will not let you know whether or not their tendons and ligaments are truly resilient. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how that could influence the return to play strategy is that I was doing some analysis for a women's soccer program, and they were like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Her asymmetry is really low. Like, it's like 0% basically. They're like, why is she not asymmetrical? And I was like, well, look at her decel RFD, look at her eccentric strategy. It was like a 13, like decel RFD, which means that she was going down so slow that she was managing her brakes, that she didn't actually have to be on the brakes at all. She was turning it into a squat jump without being a squat jump. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
she was going down so slowly, she could preserve symmetry, but unless she's giving you the gap, unless she's giving you what's available, it's not a good test,
That's awesome. Cool.
All right, Coach. Well, a lot of good stuff there. But I appreciate you taking an hour and hanging out with us and kind of unpacking all your brain on us there. But we'll definitely be in touch, and glad I got to spend some time with you. And thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that, guys.
All right, man.